Welcome to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified, your go-to for navigating Indian law with clarity and confidence.
Clarity and confidence, exactly.
Today's deep dive is especially for all you Indian law students.
Yes.
We're going to untangle the world of international legislation surrounding refugees and stateless persons.
Okay.
You might be thinking, why should I care about international refugee law
Right.
when India hasn't even signed the major treaties?
That's a very good question.
But India still deals with a huge number of refugees and asylum seekers.
Exactly. Even though we haven't ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention or its 1967 protocol, getting a grasp on the global framework can really help you understand the legal precedents and the big humanitarian issues.
The humanitarian considerations.
Yeah.
Right? It's like having a zoomed out map before you zero in on a specific region.
Exactly.
So where do we even start with a topic this broad?
Well, let's begin with who even qualifies as a refugee. The 1951 Refugee Convention offers the most widely accepted definition. It focuses on a well-founded fear of persecution based on things like race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or being part of a particular social group.
Okay, that makes sense. But I've also heard about the Cartagena Declaration.
Right.
It seems like it broadens the definition even further, right?
The Cartagena Declaration, that's right. It says that refugees also include those fleeing generalized violence, internal conflicts, or massive human rights violations.
Okay.
Now, this broader definition is actually a major point of debate in refugee law. Not all countries agree with expanding it this much.
So there's no single universally accepted definition of who gets refugee status.
No.
That does complicate things.
It certainly does.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this deep dive is so important.
Yes.
Let's bring it back to India, though.
Sure.
How do we actually handle refugees, considering we haven't ratified the convention?
Well, India relies heavily on our own constitution.
Okay.
Especially Article 21, which guarantees the right to life and liberty. That's our foundation for offering protection.
Article 21. That's the big one for human rights in India.
Yes.
But how does that play out in actual cases?
There have been some key court cases that shed light on how India applies these principles.
Oh.
For instance, the NHRC v. State of Arunachal Pradesh case from 1996 really affirmed the rights of asylum seekers.
Interesting. I know the Dr. Malvika Karlikar v. Union of India case from 1992 also touched on this topic.
Yes?
Didn't it address the role of the UNHCR in India?
Yes.
Even without us formally signing the convention.
You're absolutely right that case acknowledged that the UNHCR has a presence and is active in India.
Okay.
It's a really fascinating example of how India engages with these international organizations even without being legally bound by the treaties.
So we might not be obligated to follow the convention, but we still work with the UNHCR and recognize their work here.
Exactly.
It seems like they have a pretty big job on their hands globally.
They absolutely do. The UNHCR is central to protecting refugees and stateless persons worldwide. Think registration, determining refugee status, providing documents, advocating for their rights, and finding lasting solutions for these displaced people.
While researching this episode, I learned that the UNHCR was given a permanent mandate back in 2003. And it's supposed to last until the refugee problem is solved.
Oh.
It makes you think, does the very existence of the UNHCR point to the fact that this problem is never going to truly be solved?
It's a sobering thought.
It's definitely a sobering thought. And speaking of complicated challenges, we can't forget about statelessness.
Right.
It seems like a hidden crisis.
You hit the nail on the head. Statelessness affects millions globally, and it often flies under the radar. The 1954 convention lays it out pretty clearly. Statelessness means someone isn't considered a national by any country.
So they're in a sort of limbo with no legal belonging anywhere.
Exactly. Think about the difficulties of having no nationality, no passport, limited access to basic rights, a constant feeling of not belonging. The UNHCR has its work cut out for them, trying to identify these populations, fight for their rights, and support legal systems to prevent more people from becoming stateless.
It's hard to believe that in our interconnected world, there are people who fall through the cracks of nationality and citizenship.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about who qualifies as a refugee, how India approaches the issue, and the crucial role of the UNHCR. But what about solutions? What happens to these people who are forced from their homes?
Well, one option is repatriation, which basically means returning to their home country.
And I'm guessing the UNHCR helps make that happen.
Absolutely. They're all about promoting voluntary repatriation, which means the return has to be safe, dignified, and most importantly, the refugee's own choice. They monitor conditions in the home country to make sure it's truly safe for people to go back.
I came across this term while I was researching. Return in adverse circumstances. What exactly does that mean?
That's a really important distinction. It means that even if a refugee says they want to go back, they might not actually be choosing freely.
Okay.
Maybe there's pressure, intimidation, or the situation back home is so bad they feel they have no other choice.
So even if they agree, their consent might not be genuine.
Exactly.
And it's not enough to just get their consent. You have to make sure conditions back home are stable and they're not being forced into it. That's a lot to consider.
It is, and this is where understanding the fundamental principles of refugee protection is so crucial.
Like the principle of non-refoulement.
Exactly. Non-refoulement is the cornerstone of refugee law. It basically says that you absolutely cannot send a refugee back to a place where they'll be persecuted. No exceptions. The 1951 Convention is very clear on that.
So no matter what, you can't send someone back into danger. It seems pretty straightforward.
You'd think so, right? But in reality, upholding this principle can be incredibly challenging.
Speaking of challenges, I found a quote in the IPU handbook that really struck me. It said, and I quote, "Asylum seekers have become something of a campaign issue, with governments appearing toughest on the bogus asylum seekers flooding into their countries." It's pretty unsettling.
It really is. That quote raises an important point about the political pressures that often work against refugee protection. Sadly, refugees are often scapegoated and dehumanized in these political discussions, which makes it that much harder to make sure their rights are being respected as future legal professionals. That's something we need to be acutely aware of.
It reminds us that law isn't just about principles written down somewhere.
Yeah.
It's about working within complex social and political realities.
You said it, and even though India hasn't officially signed the convention, our parliamentarians still have a role to play.
What do you mean, what can they do?
They can advocate for national legislation that's in line with international standards, even if we haven't signed those treaties, and they can work to change public perception, promoting respect and tolerance for refugees in our society.
So even without being legally bound by the convention, India can still create laws that reflect its spirit, ensuring we uphold the principles of refugee protection.
Precisely. And by pushing back against negative narratives, we can start to shift public opinion and create a more welcoming environment.
That's a great point. Change can happen on multiple levels.
Exactly.
We can change the legal framework, and we can work to change people's minds.
It's all connected, but unfortunately, there's another challenge that's growing worldwide. We're seeing more and more countries closing their borders and detaining asylum seekers.
It's ironic, isn't it? The very countries that talk about human rights are turning away the people seeking refuge.
It's definitely a worrying trend. We have to remember that seeking asylum is a fundamental human right, not some criminal act.
But we see it happening more and more. Asylum seekers being criminalized often just because of how they arrived or because they don't have the right documents. It seems like the focus is shifting from protecting people to punishing them for coming here illegally.
And that brings up another crucial point from the 1951 Convention. It specifically says that refugees can't be penalized for entering a country illegally.
So even if they cross a border without permission,
Yes,
we still have to consider their need for protection.
exactly. Their claim still needs to be assessed fairly, and their rights, as laid out in the convention, have to be protected. That means access to courts, freedom of movement, and economic and social rights that are comparable to those of citizens.
So the convention aims to create a level playing field, giving refugees a real chance to rebuild their lives with dignity, regardless of how they got here.
That's the idea. It's about recognizing their humanity and their right to seek safety and a better future.
This is a lot to take in.
It is.
It's such a complex web of legal principles and human rights considerations.
It certainly is, but as we go deeper, you'll start to see how all the pieces fit together.
I'm ready to keep going. What's next on the agenda?
Okay, you're right. It is a lot to digest, but you're doing great so far.
Yeah.
Remember earlier when we touched on the different categories of forced migrants? There's almost a hierarchy of status.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling how someone's level of protection depends on the specific circumstances that force them to flee. Like, not all displacement is created equal in the eyes of the law.
That's a sharp observation, and it's a good reminder that even though we're focusing on the legal framework around refugees, there are tons of people facing similar challenges who might not get the same attention.
Right.
Think about internally displaced persons or those who have to leave their homes because of natural disasters or big development projects.
They might not fit the legal definition of a refugee, but they're still struggling and displaced. It makes you realize that legal categories don't always reflect the full picture of what people are going through.
Absolutely. Keeping that broader context in mind is key, but even within the category of refugees,
Right.
there are important distinctions. For example, the difference between an asylum seeker and a recognized refugee.
Oh, right. So if someone crosses a border seeking protection, they're considered an asylum seeker until their claim is reviewed, and then they can be granted refugee status.
Exactly, and that's where the principle of non-refoulement comes into play again big time.
Okay.
It applies to asylum seekers too,
Okay.
meaning even while their claim is being processed, they can't be sent back to a place where they could be in danger.
So even if someone enters a country without authorization and hasn't officially been recognized as a refugee,
Right.
they still have basic rights and protections.
It all comes back to upholding human dignity and ensuring a fair process for everyone seeking asylum.
Okay. This all sounds very idealistic and well-intentioned in theory,
Yeah.
but how does it work in practice, especially when you have mass influxes of people fleeing conflict or persecution?
Right.
It seems like the system would get overloaded.
That's a really valid point. In emergency situations, things can get incredibly complex and fast. Imagine thousands, even millions of people crossing borders all at once trying to process individual asylum claims. In that kind of scenario, it becomes almost impossible from a logistical standpoint.
So what happens then? Do the legal protections just disappear?
It's not at
The
all.
1951 convention and the UNHCR actually have provisions for handling these mass influx situations. It usually involves something called group determination of refugee status.
So instead of evaluating each person individually,
Yes.
they assess the situation in the country of origin and grant refugee status to the whole group based on what's happening there.
Exactly. It's a recognition that when you have a huge exodus of people from a country facing widespread violence or persecution, it's safe to assume that most, if not all of those fleeing, are legitimately in need of protection.
It sounds like a pragmatic approach. It balances the need to act quickly and efficiently with the core principle of non-refoulement. But I imagine there are still challenges even with group determination.
Of course, there are always logistical hurdles in providing aid and shelter to such a large number of people, and you often see political pushback from the host communities who might feel overwhelmed by the influx. It's never easy, but the international community has developed systems and guidelines to try and manage these situations as humanely and effectively as possible. And even in those chaotic situations, the principle of non-refoulement still holds firm.
Absolutely, it's the bedrock of refugee protection no matter what the circumstances are.
Okay, good to know. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about something that often causes confusion. The difference between refugee status and other forms of international protection. I keep hearing terms like temporary protection or complementary protection thrown around. What are those all about?
These are definitely important distinctions to make. Temporary protection, as the name implies, offers a temporary safe haven for people fleeing conflict or disaster. It's usually granted in emergency situations when you have that mass influx of people we were talking about earlier.
This is like a quick, immediate response
Right.
to provide safety without having to go through the whole process of individual refugee status determination.
You nailed it. But here's the thing. Temporary protection is not meant to replace the full protections outlined in the 1951 convention. It's a short-term measure. People granted this status should still have access to asylum procedures and a chance to apply for full refugee status if needed.
It acts as a bridge, giving them immediate safety while a more detailed assessment of their individual claim can be done. That makes sense. What about complementary protection? How is that different?
Complementary protection is a bit different. It's granted to individuals who might not meet the strict definition of a refugee under the 1951 convention, but who would face a real risk of serious harm if they were sent back to their home country.
So it's kind of like a safety net for those who fall through the cracks of the traditional refugee definition.
I like that analogy. It's about recognizing that the world has changed since 1951, the kinds of threats people face have evolved, and complementary protection tries to fill those gaps,
Yeah.
making sure that anyone facing persecution or serious harm isn't sent back into danger, even if they don't check all the boxes of the traditional refugee definitions.
It's getting pretty nuanced, isn't it?
Yeah. It definitely is. And this is where having a solid understanding of international human rights law becomes absolutely essential, even in countries like India, which haven't ratified the 1951 convention. There are other international treaties and conventions that offer protection to people facing persecution or serious harm.
You're talking about things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right?
Exactly. These documents lay out fundamental human rights, like the prohibition against torture, cruel or inhuman treatment, and arbitrary detention. These rights apply to everyone, regardless of their nationality or immigration status.
So even if a country isn't bound by the specific obligations of the Refugee Convention, it still has the responsibility to uphold basic human rights for everyone within its borders, including asylum seekers and refugees.
That's a key point. Human rights law provides a baseline level of protection for everyone, no matter what their legal status is.
Okay, it's all starting to come together now, but I have to admit, the sheer complexity of this is a bit overwhelming. So many legal documents, overlapping definitions, regional variations, and evolving interpretations.
Yeah.
How are we as law students even supposed to wrap our heads around it all?
I understand feeling overwhelmed. Don't worry, you don't have to become an expert overnight. The key is to build a solid foundation and take it one step at a time.
So where should we focus our attention? What are the absolute must-knows in this field?
Understanding the core principles is essential: non-refoulement, non-discrimination, the right to seek asylum. These are the building blocks of refugee protection.
And for there, we can dive deeper into the different legal instruments, regional frameworks, and case law to see how those principles actually play out in the real world.
Exactly. Don't get bogged down trying to memorize every detail of every treaty. Focus on grasping the key concepts and how they interact with each other.
That's helpful advice. It's about understanding the logic behind it all, the big picture, and the humanitarian goals driving this whole area of law.
That's the spirit. And don't be afraid to ask questions, look for more resources, and discuss what you're learning with your classmates and professors. The more you engage with this topic, the more you'll start to see how it all connects and appreciate the nuances.
That's encouraging. It's about approaching it with curiosity and a willingness to learn, not being intimidated by how complex it can seem.
Absolutely. And always remember, learning about refugee law isn't just about acquiring knowledge. It's about cultivating empathy and a sense of justice. These are real people's lives we're discussing. Understanding their legal rights and the challenges they face can help us create a more just and compassionate world.
That's a powerful reminder. It's about connecting those legal principles with the actual human stories behind them.
Well said, and that's why understanding the political and social context shaping refugee law is so important. It's not just a bunch of abstract rules. It's a reflection of how we as a global community choose to respond to people fleeing persecution and seeking safety.
So it's as much about understanding the law as it is about understanding the world around us and the forces that shape it.
Precisely. And as future legal professionals, you have a unique opportunity to use your knowledge and skills to make a real difference in the lives of those who are most vulnerable.
It's inspiring to think that our understanding of refugee law can actually contribute to a more just and humane world. I'm definitely motivated to keep exploring this fascinating and, yes, challenging field. What else should we delve into? I feel like we've covered so much ground already, but I'm sure there's still more to uncover.
There's always more.
So where do we go from here?
Well, let's shift gears a bit and look at some practical aspects of refugee protection
Right
that
on.
are especially relevant for aspiring lawyers here in India.
Sounds good. What should we focus on?
One area that often gets overlooked is the role of legal aid and
Yeah.
making sure refugees and asylum seekers have access to justice.
That's a good point, because even if someone has a legitimate claim for asylum, navigating the legal system can be incredibly daunting, especially if they're not familiar with the language, the laws, or just how things work here.
Exactly. That's why access to legal aid is so essential. It helps level the playing field, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or resources, has a fair chance to present their case and exercise their rights.
So as law students, we could potentially get involved by volunteering with organizations that provide legal aid to refugees.
Absolutely. There are tons of NGOs and legal aid clinics all across India
Wow.
that are doing incredible work to support refugees and asylum seekers. Volunteering with these organizations is a fantastic way to gain practical experience, hone your legal skills, and actually make a tangible difference in people's lives.
That's definitely something I'll be looking into. What other practical aspects should we be thinking about?
Another area worth exploring is the concept of durable solutions. We talked about repatriation earlier, but there are other options for refugees who simply can't return to their home countries.
Like integration into the local community.
Precisely, local integration is all about helping refugees build new lives in the country where they've sought asylum. That might include access to language classes, job opportunities, education, and healthcare. It's about giving them the tools and support they need to become self-sufficient and contribute to their new communities.
It sounds like it requires a lot of effort from both sides, though I imagine local integration can be challenging both for the refugees trying to adapt and for the host communities trying to be welcoming.
You're right, it's not always easy. There can be cultural differences, language barriers, and even economic anxieties to navigate it. Takes a real commitment to understanding and collaboration from everyone involved.
And what if local integration just isn't feasible either because the refugee can't adapt to the new environment or the host country isn't able to provide the support they need? Is there another option?
Yes, there is. It's called resettlement to a third country.
So in cases where a refugee can't safely return home or integrate locally, they might be resettled to another country that's willing to offer them protection and a chance to start over.
That's the idea. Resettlement is usually reserved for the most vulnerable refugees, like those with serious health issues, survivors of trauma, or those facing specific dangers in the country where they initially sought asylum. It's truly a lifeline for those who have exhausted all other options.
But I imagine it's a pretty complicated process.
It is. Resettlement involves coordinating efforts between multiple countries and organizations. The UNHCR plays a crucial role in identifying refugees who are eligible for resettlement and working with potential host countries to make the process as smooth as possible.
It sounds like finding durable solutions is a constant balancing act, taking into account the needs and safety of the refugees, the capacity and willingness of different countries, and the often messy realities of global politics and economics.
It definitely is, and that's precisely why advocacy and raising awareness are so important.
You're talking about the role of NGOs, human rights defenders, and even just ordinary citizens who are informed and passionate about this issue, people who speak out and push for policies that are more humane and effective.
Exactly. Real change rarely happens in isolation. It takes pressure from all levels, from grassroots activism to international diplomacy.
So even if we don't end up specializing in refugee law, we can still use our voices and our understanding of this complex area to push for positive change.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about refugee law, the better equipped you'll be to challenge misconceptions, counter negative narratives, and promote empathy and understanding.
That's really empowering. It's not just about learning the law, it's about using that knowledge to make a real difference in the world. This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's a field that's both intellectually challenging and deeply moving when you consider the human stories at the heart of it all.
It's been my pleasure to guide you through this complex landscape. I hope this deep dive has given you a solid foundation to build upon and sparked your interest in exploring these issues further.
It definitely has. And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on LexTalks. We hope you found this deep dive informative and engaging. Remember, understanding the law isn't just about passing exams. It's about equipping yourselves to make a positive impact on the world around you.
Well said. The journey of learning, especially in the field of law, never really ends. To keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop fighting for a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for being part of LexTalks. Subscribe and join us as we continue to simplify legal learning.